All right, so Eric, do you want to talk to this?
Yep, sure. So in Microsoft Extensions configuration, there's an API today, obviously, to get a certain section. And even if that section is missing, it'll never return null. It just returns basically an empty object, right? And the the example the example problem here, if you scroll down a little bit, well, it's actually right there, usage examples, is like in this config.add nlog, new nlog logging configuration, and then passing in configuration.gets. If you get required section is the new proposed API, but if you pass in get section, parens nlog, it'll get section, even if it's not there, will return an empty object, and then nlogging configuration will basically it'll basically not log anything
Right.
because there was nothing configured in that section. And so the proposal here is to add a new API called get required section. And what get required section will do is if that section doesn't exist or it's empty, it'll throw an exception. So this is analogous, like he says, it's analogous to get required service in dependency injection. So in dependency injection, you can say, give me this service. And if the service doesn't exist, it'll return null, but you can say, give me a required service. And if the service doesn't exist, it throws an invalid op exception.
Yeah, so how does this play with dependency injection when you import an I configuration? You're still responsible for calling get section and get required section yourself anyway, right? So basically what I'm trying to
Correct.
get is like ASP.NET never calls get section for you, right? You always do this yourself, basically, right? Or the code, or the customer code, depending on who is doing it, whether that's nlog or the application developer.
Right.
So that
I
makes
mean,
sense.
there's some cases where, certain components will call get section, right? Because if certain components have knowledge of configuration, and we'll look to see if there's, existing key set in the configuration. But it'll always call get section, and then it'll act like, that key doesn't exist, and basically existing code will just continue to work, right? It's just a new API that'll throw when somebody wants to say, hey, I need whoever's configuring this app to fill out this section.
Yeah, my concern is not that existing code doesn't work. It's more like, take the service one, right? Very few people call get service, right? The vast majority of people just imports them with DI, right? So like if that's the case for configuration, my concern is just cool. We have an API that almost nobody will be able to use because DI basically just calls get required section, right? But if that's not the case, if the only thing you import is I configuration, then you call get section yourself, then I think it's totally fine. Um, the only concern I have is, and I think I said this before down there, like to me it doesn't seem like this is required to be an actual interface method, because basically I think the implementation, the PR linked, was also just a calls get section, and if that thing doesn't have any keys or is empty, it throws, which means we could trivially make it an extension method, and we should generally not break people for things like
Yeah,
that.
I mean, if this was a base class, right? If they did have abstract base class configuration,
Yeah.
then maybe you could make the justification, but I totally agree that this fits better as an extension method. And then I went and looked at get required service, and that's actually implemented as an extension method as well. So
Yeah.
I totally agree it should be an extension method.
I think Eric had one other question, which is how does one distinguish from present but empty section? I guess you can't, right? Because it's basically the same as an empty section.
That's my understanding as well.
Yeah, I mean, I understand
I mean,
what.
there is an exists. There is already an exists configuration for an I configuration section. You can ask if it exists or not.
I see.
That there's already a method to do that.
So you can get it, and then if it looks empty, then ask, did you actually exist, and then throw.
Yeah, what is it? I configuration section? Is that where the API is on?
This one is also an extension method,
Nope, that's not
which
the
is
one.
why I love extension methods, because you have no idea where they are.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing for the new API catalog. I'm indexing extension methods now, so we can actually see them where they are, rather than where they were defined.
If these types are on MSDN would have it. It does
It's
that
on
linking.
configuration extensions. Yep, exists right there. It's second to the bottom.
What does this thing do?
Yeah, I was just going to find it.
I think it probably does exactly what the guy in the PR did, which is, if not null and not empty.
This one's in abstractions.
If it's null, return false.
Yep, it's exactly
Otherwise,
it.
any. So.
Yeah, that's the same logic he had in the PR. So
Yeah.
basically, we can rip that out and say, if exists, get it. If exists, if doesn't exist, throw. So.
Yeah, I mean, you don't really even need to call exists if you were doing the same logic, but I guess yeah, get it and then call exists, and then you don't have to replicate the logic.
Right. At least that way they're always going to be the same, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. From my point of view, like it's totally reasonable. I think extension methods make sense. I hear what I'm probably butchering his name now, Michelle or Michael is saying, which is, yeah, it would be nice to have it on the same type, but at the same time, that ship has sailed when we shipped I configuration, right? So I would just say, sorry, that's
yeah.
that's
I
no
think
an
an
option.
extension method is totally reasonable here. It's way better than trying to do a dim or break the interface. So
Yeah. All right. So then, let me just post this one here, removing the implementation because we don't care about implementation.
is invalid. The only question I had was invalid operation exception.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, do we already have a configuration specific exception? Does that exist actually?
I didn't see one. It's not in abstractions.
That doesn't seem to have.
Don't we have one from system configuration? Like section not found exception?
But you don't want to use that one, right?
Right. That's
because
for
then
system.
because that's the legacy configuration system. You don't want to pull that guy in just to throw the exception. I mean, we could type forward it, but like.
I just wonder where the exception ended up living.
Or the one for literally the old system configuration? Yeah, probably in system configuration manager.
So I did look at, again, DI, get required service, and that one does throw invalid operation exception. So then I was kind of like, well, that does kind of make it symmetrical here. I wouldn't have chose invalid op, I guess. I would have chose argument exception, but because it's like the key, but that's not right either, because it's like you know the caller didn't screw up, right? It's the person who configured the app. So
Yeah,
maybe
I mean,
invalid op is the right thing.
Yeah, I think get required is kind of like if you call get required, it's clearly not a bug to call it with a non-existing key, right? That's that is kind of the exact. I mean, it's kind of like parse, right? You don't throw argument exception either. You just throw format exception usually, right? Which
Right.
is because basically I would say if you see an argument exception, your code has a bug. Versus this one, yeah, there is a bug somewhere, but it's not the call sort of get required section, right? It's somebody misconfigured the thing.
That's true. And normally you wouldn't call this and then catch an invalid operation exception, right? Because like, well, if you wanted to handle when it was empty, you should call the other method.
Right. I mean, this
Right?
one is
So
yeah. I mean, in general, yes, you would do that, but like in this case, yeah, you have a different method to call. It's like parse, right? Don't call parse, call try parse if you.
Right. Exactly.
Um.
Okay. I'm fine with invalid op. I just wanted to have the conversation, I guess.
I mean, unless Jeremy has strong opinions, but.
I mean, if we care about having a specific type exception later, we can make one that derives from invalid operation exception. But
okay.
In like invalid operation exceptions, default message is, you know, the object state was not valid for the operation. You called get required and it's missing. Well, the state is not valid for the operation.
We'd give it a better message though, but yeah.
Ooh, fancy.
I mean, it's pretty reasonable to say this section doesn't exist and pass in the name of the section.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. If we don't have if there's not an appropriate exception already there, it actually looks like I can't even find one from system configuration. I think it just returns null. So, yeah, invalid operation seems fine to me.
Okay.
Like, this is really one of those, like, you run something, it crashes at startup, you fix your config, you move on with life. It doesn't need to be super pretty. So.
Right. Totally agree. Okay.
All right, then I think we can say this is approved with this little tweak here. And then we are good to go. Any other concerns, or did I capture everything?
I think that was it.
Just one thing I remember, I'm trying to look at the PR. I think Eric St. John had a comment on the API. I'm just trying to look it up real quick.
I only saw one comment from him here on this issue, but I didn't actually check the PR.
Yeah, he's got a PR out for it. It's linked right there. Oop, nope. Oh.
Where did I see it?
Right there, 7 hours ago.
Yeah, I looked at the PR briefly to find his implementation, but I didn't actually check for comments.
So down there somewhere.
Yeah.
Eric St. John says.
Yeah, he's basically saying the same thing I was saying, which is let's not make this an interface change.
Okay.
Well, that's not the approved API anyway, so good.
Yeah, it's fine. I mean, that's why. Yeah. That's not a strong enough reason. Maybe I should actually say what I mean. All right, so then this one is done. So Jan was proposing this one here, which is, kind of in line with what Stephen Tope did the other day with current process ID, right? You can already get the process executable path, but basically the way you would do it, you would say process get current process, main module.filename, I think. And Jan is basically proposing just making this a thing that lives directly off of environment, which I think is reasonable. Because it is a fairly common problem people need to solve. Now, as we were discussing this, it turns out that it's actually not the only way, or not the only thing, basically. So I was saying the way I usually do it is with environment get command line args subscript 0, which is basically this thing here. But this doesn't give you the actual executable, as it turns out. That gives you the virtualized executable. So if you call this method today in .NET Core in a shared framework environment, you will actually get not .NET exe, you will actually get foo.dll or whatever your entry point is, right? So basically what I'm proposing is I'm personally fine with having this nuance to say like, sorry, there's different things we could give you and you have to choose. The only thing I don't like is basically this situation that we have here, which is, well, we have no environment.process executable path. We still have environment get command line arg subscript 0, and we have app context.base directory. And depending on your scenario, you have to pick one of them. And my problem with that is that people are not very likely to discover all three of them if they're all on disjoint APIs, right? And most people will probably stumble upon this thing in environment. Unfortunately, though, that's probably not what most people want, because the thing is, if you actually run in a shared framework environment, the path to .NET exe is usually not that useful, right? It's usually what you care about is the path to your stuff, because then you use it to either load files or find native modules or something like that, right? And the same is true with the directory. Right? The directory is actually a very common thing. I actually didn't even know of app context.base directory. I usually ended up doing get command line arg subscript 0 and then get basically path of that, like the directory path of that, which works because it basically points to your main, right? And then that was what I was using. But of course, just calling environment dot something would be much easier. So my argument is I think having all three makes sense, but I'd rather have them next to each other with some naming convention that ties them together and that explains to developers what the different choices are and how you would choose them, right? So basically I would rename slightly what Jan proposed. I would call it application process path. just because then we have application as the prefix for all three of them. And then, process path is documented as being the actual operating system's process that launched your stuff, which usually will be .NET.exe. We will have entry point path, which is the main module, wherever your main lives. And then you have application base directory, which is just the alias for app context or base directory.
So why on environment and why not app context? Like it seems like, in my opinion, it seems like a little bit more targeted place to put these things, right? Where environment kind of feels like a grab bag. It's kind of the conversation we had about the
the thing is, so app context is relatively recent, and if you look at it, it's not really a type that I would want to promote, because it is kind of the quirky stuff, right? It's like, magic switches and stuff like that, which I don't think that's, like, there's not a lot of stuff on it that people care about, versus environment is the opposite, right? That's where we put all the stuff that's actually useful. That's where you get the command line arcs. That's where you get, whether you're 64-bit or not, and that one is used by a lot more people today. So I would probably expect to find it on environment if I had to search for it. I just find it weird. I mean, I could probably live with all three of them being on app context as well.
At least there you wouldn't need a prefix, right? Because the class is the prefix, right? App context dot process path, app context dot entry point path.
Maybe I just like the last one, the base directory, assuming that is the directory where main module came from. To me, that feels fair enough. It feels analogous to asking current working directory before anybody has a chance to set it. And so if people are already looking on environment, then that's probably the reasonable place to put this one. And then, well, if they're getting entry point path from command line args, then obviously that sort of makes sense there as well. And then process path, like, honestly, why does anyone care about .NET.exe? It's a detail that almost no one wants.
Yeah, so Jan's argument is basically, so today we don't have an API like that, so you basically have to do this, and he just wants an API that is simple, right? So that is well defined and not virtualized.
The thing is, it's not necessarily an implementation detail. Like, one example in this issue was, I want to spin up another one of my same processes, right? How do I do that?
Yeah.
It's like if I was invoked, right? Like if I didn't have an exe for me, because I was invoked by .NET.exe path to my .dll. I think, I mean, this is valuable. It's valuable, I think. I've had to work around this before, especially in the SDK.
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing with forking is it's pretty straightforward. Whether you're shared framework or not doesn't matter. You just basically get the application process path, get all command line arguments, and that's it, right? And then you basically already have the right thing working. So that's kind of nice, right? And then there's
when we
other
say application entry point path. Like, well, one, that should be nullable, right? Because I can be invoked by a native host.
Well,
and so there was no main method.
So the reason I didn't do that is, like, do we actually return you an empty array then? I don't think we do, right?
I don't know what Git command line args does, but I mean, that's definitely a scenario that we care about. A custom native host loading up .NET Core and invoking code in it.
Yeah, I mean, I just defined it over get command line args. I don't think this will ever return an empty array. I think it will always have at least one entry in it. But yeah, we should probably double check what it returns in that case. I mean,
browser is another case where what's the application entry point there, right? There's no main method.
Yeah, clearly, right? So whatever argument Jan had to make application process path nullable applies to application entry point path as well.
Presumably base directory also makes no sense in WebAssembly.
Well, yes and no, right? It probably does, in the sense that that's logically where your app lives. The problem is it's probably not like C program files, right? It's probably going to be some, if we ever do I/O, we would probably give you a virtualized path, right?
I mean, if it can give something, then sure. But if it's going to give back null or the empty string, then
Yeah.
Maybe it should be null and we should mark it as nullable.
Yeah. So how about this then? Let me actually just take the notes of what we just said and then just see what Jan responds to that. When he's
Yeah,
back.
app context base directory is actually non-nullable because it returns string.empty. In the fallback case,
I
it'll
see.
always return string.empty.
I mean, we could probably normalize that if we cared, right? Because I mean, the question is what you're doing with it, right? If you immediately give it to path dot or to file dot, yeah, if you immediately give it to path dot combine file name, then that's probably going to be problematic.
Especially if you have a slash at the beginning of your.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, then you just have all the path problems anyway.
Yeah.
Because if write is rooted to something, whether it's drive rooted or absolute rooted, then path.combine does things.
So like this kind of is some of the same conversation we had about the is operating system stuff, right? Like at what point is environment just a dumping ground, and at what point is app context no longer relevant, right? Like it feels like app context is the right thing for this. It already has base directory. This would be my app context process and entry point paths being added to it.
So
It's just we don't like it because it's new.
Well, the question
so we
is,
shouldn't add more APIs to it.
well, let's start differently. Like, what's wrong with environment?
Because with the operating system stuff, my concern was that we were adding so many members to environment that it was hiding the ones that you actually care about, like get environment variables. But since these new things are really, they're still back to interpretations of the PEB. I mean, Windows detail, but they're telling you how the process started and giving you a view into the execution context of the app instead of having 18 different members to ask, is the OS that the app is running on Windows 10? This feels, to me, a little bit more appropriate to environment than all the OS stuff did. Like the OS I was fine with being buried under environment. It was going to be too many top level members. It was going to almost double the size of this list. That was my concern. Other people may have had different concerns.
I mean, maybe the part that I can't get in my head is like, what's app context for?
So my opinion of app context is that it's mostly for implementation of ourselves. Like I would generally not expect customers to use it because it basically has things like our compat switches on it, which the vast majority of people will never use and shouldn't use. So I mean, to me, it's kind of unfortunate that it's public in the first place.
Properties. It's got two properties, right? Base directory and target framework name.
Yeah.
And then 3 methods that are about switches, basically. Get data, set switch, try get switch.
Right, but the main reason for exposing the target framework name is for all the things that want to start up and do a switch off of the target framework to determine which state they want their default quirks to be in. And
but why isn't that part of environment? Like,
well, because
right? Because we didn't want people looking at it.
Yeah, same rationale. Right? We didn't want to promote it to everybody, which is why we didn't put environment.
So app context is the place where we put more or less internal APIs that we don't want people to use, and environment's the place where
it's the place where we put things related to quirking your app.
I mean, quite frankly, I don't know why we put it in system. Like, I mean, it seems
that one I can't answer.
Like it probably should have lived in like system runtime versioning or something, because I really see this more as a runtime building block for quirking or something to that extent. Like it should not be. I mean, it's very recent type too, right? I mean, I think it's a .NET Core V1, probably V2 era.
Yeah, I mean, we have net standard stuff for it. But
Yeah, 1.0. Yeah, we probably put it in net standard because
it's at 4.6, right?
Context, I think, was added in 4.6 to deal with 4.5, 4.6 in-place upgrades. It's when we started introducing quirking.
That's right. Oh yeah, we put it in .NET Framework as well. Yeah, we had to because we needed it for our U packages, and we can't have private APIs. So I think that's why it's there. Again, I don't know why we put it in system though. That should have raised at least 2 red flags, but for some reason we did it.
Yeah, it's slightly before my time.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I was around. But I don't ever remember having looked at the namespace. We probably did because we did. I remember that we did an API review on it, but I don't. I think that was before the time we actually had good notes, so I can't go back.
The get data and get switch stuff is interesting too because they're duplicate APIs of app domain, right?
Yes, I think those were added later though, exactly for that reason. Like I think the get data API, I'm pretty sure came after. Yeah, so it was in 4.7 because we added it to .NET Core V1 in order to replace app domains. Yeah.
So it just this type feels really wonky to me, to tell you the honest truth.
Oh, totally.
That
That's why I'm saying I should not put more stuff on it. Like to me, it's kind of like it's another ward in the system namespace that ideally should have been hidden in system runtime versioning or something. Like it's the functionality itself makes sense. I'm not even opposed to the API or its shape. It's just that it is basically the building block for the runtime to get versioning right? To actually have backwards compatibility. And that should not be in everybody's face. I mean, it's alphabetically, unfortunately, even before app domains. So that's the first time in system now.
Yeah, so base directory and target framework name are both forwarders to app domain.current domain. So they were both added for core because we deleted app domain.
Yeah.
So it was what's a place that's not in someone's face that we can dump this?
Okay.
But yeah, so really to me, it's if we think that this is something that more than 10% of people are going to care about, then actually 10% is a really big number for environment. If this is a thing that feels like a popular Stack Overflow question, which I imagine it is, then environment feels more appropriate because it's a place people I think would look for. Where did my process come from?
Okay.
So.
And the thing is, this is only going to get more important as like single file becomes more of a thing. Because normally the way I would get some of these, like if I wanted my entry point, right? It's like I would get assembly.get entry point assembly.location, and that doesn't work in single file.
So why would that not work in single file?
Every assembly.location doesn't return a string.
Oh, sorry, you're saying you would use assembly.location? Yeah, okay, I can see that not working, but I would say that by and large, if people do single file or self-contained, application entry point path will give you the path to logically your module, right? So like if you just want to do that, that's your single stop API to just get the path to where your code lives, which in single file would be your actual exe, and self-contained it would be the native host, but it doesn't really matter. And then for framework dependent, it would be foo.dll. But either way, if you just get the directory path from it, you're in the right location, right? And then application process path is really the more specialized one, where it's like, well, do you actually need the operating system's entry point, which is rare, right? It's like forking is one example, but I don't think there's many examples where you need that. But I think it's an important difference that we can't hide, right? To have exploit-loaded implementation detail. Like if you actually have to fork the process, you have to know what your actual entry point was. Or I should say process path is. All right, so then it seems like we are all more or less on the same page, and it's just a function of like whether Jan agrees with that. Should we approve?
Are we talking about the nullability stuff on this?
Yeah, so I marked them all nullable, and I also added a note to it that we should probably make it nullable. And yes, app context was not nullable, but we could normalize it. Should we approve the API until Jan pushes back, or?
I mean, all the prefixes of application feel a little weird to me, but I can't think of a better one, so.
I mean, we could shorten it to app if the length is the concern. I just want something that ties them together, so you actually see them in IntelliSense next to each other.
Let me see what names you picked again, or proposed.
Let me just scroll down here and put this here.
I don't know. App feels weird. Application feels stodgy, and app feels too hip. So
App feels too
let's
hip.
go with stodgy, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, to me, like, I mean, app would also work.
Yeah, I'm fine either way, I guess.
Read them out. Environment.app process path. Environment.app entry point path. Do you like that?
I don't hate it.
I was about to say
Okay.
the exact same thing. Like, yeah, normally when a name is bad, I have a very strong reaction. This one reads fine to me.
And environment.application process path. I mean, it's a little. It slides less well because application requires. I don't know. There's I guess the plosive followed by an L is a hard syllable break, but gay words. But either way feels fine.
I mean, we have app domain, right? App context, like.
Yeah.
I think it's fine to call it app. Like it.
I mean, readability wise, I actually think app is a little bit easier on the eyes because it basically makes it easier to spot the things that are different rather than the things that are. Because otherwise, you basically have this block of things that look the same. My eyes
Yeah,
don't
I-
always see the difference.
I agree. My eyes really jumping to about the fourth and fifth character of like, oh, those are different as opposed to the bottom block. It's like those are the same. Wait, one of them's longer than the others. So,
Agreed.
so yeah, let's go with app.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Are we happy with the names? Process path, entry point path.
Like, yeah, this is I can't think of a better way of describing, because I think the process path is the host path, but nobody knows what a host is. And then I don't know. I think this is just an arbitrary string that gets passed in if you use the hosting API. So it's sort of it's the host path unless the host feels like telling you something different. And the entry point path feels really awkward. If it feels to me like they should be the same thing, but I'm the tools that I write are still .NET Framework executables because, well, I haven't written code for a personal project in like 5 years. So
It's like most cases they are the same, right? Like, yes, if you don't care about technicalities, most times both of these are going to be the same thing, right? Like we generated a .exe in your
well,
bin.
but they're not. The default option is shared runtime.
No. Even like if you F5 in Visual Studio today in like a Net 5 app,
Yeah, that's a .NET 5
like
thing,
we generate
right? Or
generate a
3 thing,
exe
actually.
in your bin directory.
Yeah.
That's just like a little minimal wrapper host that says, okay, let me go find the shared framework and load that thing up.
Yeah.
And so
Fair.
it looks like,
Well, it's a bit
although
different
entry
on
point
the.
path is going to be does entry point path the .dll, right? In that case.
It would be the DLL. So like the file name would be different, but like depending on what you do next, like it's the same outcome, right? If you just say get directory name for that, then it doesn't matter, right?
Well, but if you're doing entry point path based off of the command line parsing, that presumably will be the executable, because the executable just does, I assume it's core console of find my name, rip off the exe, add DLL, and go.
So like, I mean, I'm
that implementation, I would scrap the implementation on the right, but just think about what that thing logically is.
Well,
like I don't think the first two, that's not the way we're going to implement either one of these.
To me, the only reason I added it is because that's the terms that Jan talked in, because you want to describe the behavior that
Sure.
it has, right? Like to me, it's I mean, it doesn't really matter, but like I think get command line args will probably give you the exe in the .NET 5 case where you actually have a native host that is copied to the output folder, because it will be what's launched. But the problem there is it also depends how you launch. If you go into the command and you say .NET run project, it will eventually call .NET exe with I think it will probably just call .NET exe and then exec the DLL, right?
My question is, can you reliably point any of these things at reflection and the thing it's pointing at is actually an assembly? Because if entry point path in the we generate the stub executable to launch your DLL for you is the executable, that's not IL, and reflection will fail.
I mean, with single file, I don't think this is, none of those could you point reflection at reliably, right? Because single file, it's just going to be myapp.exe, which is not.
It's not managed code, right?
Is it?
Well, I guess it depends, right? If it's a framework dependent single exe, probably is managed code, right? I mean, I honestly don't know enough about how single file works with reflection. Like, if you actually enumerate assemblies, you still get the assemblies that you should get back, but like, I don't know how that would work.
Right. So I guess I'm now concerned that we would add these things and people still can't make sense of them. So, like, what is process path versus entry point path supposed to tell me? In particular, if neither of them is the name of the file that contained main, because that's what the description here for entry point path is the name of the file that contains the main method. So presumably that can be loaded by reflection, but can it?
Yeah, for single file, I can't answer that.
So maybe we leave the middle one off? Like, what's the scenario for the middle one?
I understand the bottom one. That's where
we have that API today. The bottom one makes sense because we already have it, and I've used it a ton of times.
Yes, that's I want to load a thing next to wherever my executable was. I don't care where the working directory is.
Correct. Yep.
So I want to load a sidecar file. It's looking for execonfig or whatever. Like, I understand the bottom one. The top two I'm a little iffy on.
Well, the top one
is how do I clone myself?
I mean, not necessarily. The top one is what's the name of my process, right? I guess.
Is it the name or the full path?
Well, it's the full path. It's the full path to the thing that my process is running.
So path.getFilename of app process path is the thing that will show up in the process list /top.
Correct. Yep.
Okay. So I understand now the top one. So Emo, describe the middle one for me, please.
So I was just testing what actually ended up happening. So when you have 5 in Visual Studio, so I just printed all 3 of them, right, top to bottom. If you actually do an F5 in Visual Studio, what ends up happening is it prints console app45.exe, console app45.dll, and then the folder containing both of them. So basically, it will point to the managed DLL that contains main. If you go on the command line and you say .NET run, it's the same thing because .NET run ultimately just calls the generated host. So it will not use .NET exe to run it. If I actually manually do it, if I go to bin, debug, net5, and I say .NET exec console app DLL, then it will print what you think. It will print .NET exe, console app45.dll, and then the folder again. So it will give you the managed entry point in all 3 cases. So for single file, I don't know. But for shared framework or self-contained, it will point to the correct thing. So you could.
And your last one where it printed .NET.exe, did you do .NET the DLL?
Yeah, I did .NET exec the DLL, but like it's the same thing as not saying exec.
I was just making sure that wasn't that you executed the generated exe, and for some reason the name .NET.exe appeared out of the ether. So.
No, I did the DLL.
Okay. Right. So then I don't know why someone super wants it, but I at least then understand it is the shortcut for, hey, app domain, tell me where the entry point was and what file contained that, and like people do that, so it makes sense. So yeah, I'm fine with them now.
I'm still not on with a single file, like, which is the impetus on why this thing was in the first place, right?
Now let's see if Emo can figure out how to build a single file.
Yeah, I was about to say, like, how would I do this with .NET 5? What do I have to do to the project file to get a single file?
In the
out of it?
project file, you set publish single file true.
Publish
you dot
single
publish.
file true. And then I do .NET publish, right?
Yep.
Let me go a bunch of folders up.
Then you
API
publish
review.
it.
You learn so
you
many
need-
things.
You need a RID.
Yep, of course. Because inferring the current one would be too much to ask.
Yeah, it's impossible. I've logged that bug so many times in my head.
Okay, so it's doing its thing now. Apologies for the sound in the background. That's the cleaning lady. I'm not in an airport, I promise.
Not surprising.
Yeah, I'm volunteering myself for an airport. I got that.
So I just did it myself, and it points to a file that does not exist on disk. So
What does it point to?
it points to my published directory console app 100.dll, which is not a file.
Awesome.
I don't know what anybody would do with that, to tell you the truth.
Crash.
So here's my fun one. Like my machine, it just doesn't actually build at all. It just hangs. I guess.
That's what I get for the 3. Sorry, you have to expand it. Don't know if you can expand that window. Basically, I get console app 100.exe, console app 100.dll, and then the same directory that they're both in. And 100.exe exists, 100.dll does not exist. And if I try to just decompile the exe, it says this is not a CLR assembly. What ILDASM does.
ILDASM succeeds or fails?
I'm asking, I don't know. I'm looking it up real quick. ILDASM says this is not a valid CLR header.
So how does single file work? How do we actually merge the assemblies?
Is this AOT?
No, I mean you can switch it to AOT. Like if you put another switch on that says ready to run or publish ready to run, then it'll ready to run your stuff inside the single file.
I'm just, I guess, confused that this didn't end up looking like a managed assembly to a managed reader and a native executable to a native reader. But I guess this is the weird self-extracting zip thing still, or no?
It's not anymore. It doesn't self-extract anymore. In 3.0 and 3.1 it did.
Okay.
This one's called the superhost, is what I've heard it referred to, and it doesn't self-extract. It actually runs like you'd expect.
Eric, which
know
RID
it
did
took
you use?
5 years.
I used Win x64 because that's what machine I was on.
Yeah, you can tell from this path.
Yeah, I can't open this chat window without Teams hanging, so I did not dare.
Right. Sorry.
But like, so the thing is, if I do that, so you did just Win without version number, right?
Yeah.
Right. WIN-x64.
Yeah, as soon as it goes to determining projects to restore, it basically never completes.
Weird.
I think go check your task manager. Is it downloading like gigs of stuff?
Well, let me check.
And you're streaming and
There is memory activity, yeah. I mean, there's CPU activity right now, but that's probably because I'm streaming.
there's no big down.
Wi-Fi is there is, but it's all sending, so that's also sensible.
I don't know that.
So, the question that I have from this, Eric, is this a reason to not add this member, or is this a bug we should fix in single? Like, I guess the fact that you can't point reflection at it means there's nothing sensible that you can do for that if you want. What can you point? What can you do for to tell some other process, hey, you could load this with reflection and look at all my assembly attributes, because there's no such thing anymore.
And you'd have to pass an assembly, right? I think you couldn't. There's no longer a path because it's.
I mean, the two things I used it for is basically determining my application directory, which I now can do with app-based directory, and the name of my command line app. So when you do help about, I can actually print the full command, which you can also do with just getting the name from app process path without the extension. So I think I'm probably fine with not having the API. Get command line arg subscript 0 is obscure enough that people will probably not stumble across this all the time. But yeah, I will probably regress all my command line tools as soon as I do single file builds for them, because then my command line output will all be empty strings. But like, yeah, I don't know what, I mean, for reflection, I don't know enough about single file, but my first question for reflection is, how the heck do I get all the assemblies that were part of my app? Like, I mean, pointing it to one path probably will not help, because we don't have assembly.load set or something like this, right? So how do I even enumerate all the assemblies? And
presumably just assembly dot, hey, what are all the assemblies?
Well, but get loaded assemblies is super fragile, right? You don't want to do that. So like, what do you do in single file? That also, I mean, basically you want one API that works both for single file as well as for not single file, right?
Yeah.
And we don't have that, because in non-single file you would just get base directory, do start.dll, and then throw that at assembly, right? So like, I don't know, like it seems to me assembly.load with a path, even if the path doesn't exist, should probably continue to work.
Well,
otherwise, I don't know
what you mean by it. I guess if it's special case, this is the path that I told you for main.
Yeah, I mean, I would basically say, like, you know, make them all relative to app base directory, and then if that is a file that you know of, then return the correct assembly instance for that. I mean, how else would people do it reliably?
So I just searched for single file and get command line args, and 4 days ago, Jan logged a bug saying, when I publish for single file, this is returning a non-existing file. So,
right.
So okay, we will fix get command line args then, but then the question is still like, how does reflection work, right?
I don't think it does. Like I in this world, I don't think you can.
Why would I not be able to
load up files?
Isn't that orthogonal? I thought, like, I mean, single file doesn't mean you're aggressively linking yet, right? It just means you have a single file. Shouldn't I be able to reflect over everything?
I mean, you can. You could say app domain get loaded assemblies or whatever it's called.
Yeah, but that doesn't work for us for multiple files, right? Because I mean, on startup we don't load everything yet. So how would I get everything that makes?
You're not multiple files. You're in single file.
No, but that's what I'm saying. You want one API that works for both scenarios. You don't want an API that is broken, right? You don't want like if, because I mean, what would the if statement look like? what would I if over? Pound if, and then I have to define my own defines. That seems unfortunate.
So maybe I'm missing the scenario you're looking for.
So take the thing that we were pushing earlier, which is doing the command line host, right, with host builder and configuration, right? So somebody in that world has to reflect over all the assemblies, find effectively, you know, all the services and whatnot, and then register them for DI, right? So how would you write that code if? So
the way that stuff works today is it's not through reflection, right? Like you have like a startup project and you say,
oh, because in ASP.NET you have to call it manually. Okay, sure. Then
yeah,
let's take one of those. Then let's take another of these DI containers that do it automatically, right? Math or Ninject, where you basically have rules and says discover all the assemblies, find all the ones that have certain markers on them, and then export them, right, or import them. How would you write that code if my code is agnostic to whether it's single file or not single file?
So in this case, the catalog you want is like a folder catalog, right? That says, or a directory catalog that says all the assemblies that are in this directory.
Right, and then you would say like in single file it just happens to be one, and in the other case it's multiple.
Well, in single file, it's none. There are none directories that are CLR. Or there are no assemblies that are.
Oh, because you're saying the single file is not itself a valid CLR file, yeah.
From what I can tell, it isn't. Unless they made changes in the.
That's what I'm saying. I mean, it seems to me there's a reflection API that you want, which is basically get all stuff in my app or something, right? And that will do the right thing for single file and non-single file. But app domain get loaded assemblies is not that, because it's only returning the things you already loaded. So if you do any sort of lazy initialization, then which is by default, where we don't load everything on startup. I mean, you could of course force it, but that kind of defeats the point, right? I mean, then you would do like walk all assemblies, like get the base directory, find everything there's a DLL or exe, and then do assembly.load on it, and then ask get loaded assemblies, and then in single file, the loop is just basically only the exe file, and that would flow. So you would also have to have a catch handler around it. So like it seems a bit weird to do that.
So are we doing the top and bottom and leaving the middle one out until we know more?
I think for now, yeah. I just want to the behavior of endpoint. The API would be useful if it could be used to retrieve the assembly instance of the entry point. Oh, for fuck's sake. No, code is hanging. What is happening on my machine? All right. Thank God I had the code in a different window. All right.
What in the world is Tlicashinio?
What is it? A name?
I think it's the word "to" wrapping half of the word "application" on your.
Oh yeah, because I was
Second
typing. Yeah, I already fixed it in the other one. Single file, which makes it ill-defined. And these. Yeah, let me just keep it this way, and then, so are we okay with this summary then?
Well, that last point about app entry point path, I would just say, I would point to this bug that Jan logged.
Which one is that?
So your third bullet point, app
Yeah, you said
entry point
it's-
path
No, man,
returns empty string.
which bug is that?
Oh, 40874.
Yeah, and it's not returning empty. It's returning a path to a file that doesn't exist.
Ah, sorry,
It's just
yeah.
making up a path.
So that's the one, right? Yep.
And even if it pointed to the executable, it can't be loaded in reflection. So we need to understand what the scenarios are for it before we can really add it.
Right.
And if the scenario is you call path.getDirectory off of it, then just call the other property.
Right. And now we've up leveled app context.base directory to environment to make it more prominent for people to find it.
Because we have a scenario for that one.
Yeah, totally. That's it. Yeah, that one's used all the time. I mean, I've seen people switching off. Is that process name .net.exe, right? I could imagine people writing code environment.appProcessPath ends in .net or .net.exe. Then go look on the command line args for my DLL.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we already have an API on assembly, but that gives you the the entry point assembly, right? It's like assembly.get entry point or something, right? So if you just want to get this, you can.
You can get the assembly, but you can't get the location of it.
Well, you can get the assembly, then you can ask for .location, right? But like it's the
No,
I don't
you
know
can't.
what the
Like if you're in single file, you can't because the .location is going to return null or empty. For single file, all assembly.locations return a blank string.
right. I mean, like, so but that's kind of more like the so.
All? Like, can you, if you reflect, load it, if you did type.get type with an assembly qualified name, is it not going to probe outside the single file bundle?
Yeah, that I don't know.
Okay.
Or if you explicitly called assembly.load from
Yeah.
this file, I don't know what happens then either.
Okay.
But like entry point assembly or like type of this thing dot assembly,
Sure.
those locations are gonna.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense, right? Because they don't physically exist on disk anymore. So that makes sense to me. I mean, that's why I'm saying if the goal was to just get where main is, well, just call assembly.get entry assembly, right? If you want to reflect over the thing that contains main.
Right.
And if you want to get the actual path, well, then that scenario is just fundamentally not portable, right? So
Right.
seems reasonable to not have. And then the other question is just like, how do I get all the assemblies, right? And I think that would probably be something we should probably have an API for.
Yeah, I mean, the only weird thing that I can think of that somebody would want to understand the file for where main lived is if they wanted to, ask what the last modified time of their application is as part of a self-update check. Like, I can invent a scenario, and so if the other one's returning .net.exe, then you're like, well, that's not the one I want to check, and what's the other guy? But if the answer is .net.exe, then get entry assembly .codepath will actually be an answer. So you have to do more work because the scenario is more complicated.
Right, but in fairness, like you will very rarely get .net.exe, right? Like, if you call app process path, in almost all scenarios, it will give you your custom host.
Just depends on what scripts you've written in the last 5 years to work with core.
Right, but if you just go do .NET run, it will do the right thing. If you do F5 Visual Studio, it will do the right thing. So the only case when you manually call .NET foo.dll, right, which is not that common.
It depends, right? You published your web app to Azure app site services or whatever. How does it run it, right?
Yeah, because you wouldn't use .NET Run because you don't have a project, and .NET Run only works on as an SDK context, but .NET Exec will run on a pre-published thing.
Yeah, I guess that's fair. I mean, I'm also not entirely sure what application dot entry assembly will give you when you run an Antares either, because
Well, there, if you're an ASP.NET Core app, there is a main method that they do call, right?
yeah, that's what I'm saying though. Like, I'm not entirely sure what the glue code is, right? Like, if are they literally just calling your stuff, or is there some .NET Core loader in front of it, right? So it might still not give you your assembly. It might give you somebody else's assembly that comes from infrastructure, right? So that's,
Yeah.
I think for web apps,
sure.
it's probably an interesting scenario. How would you do version checks? But also for a website, you probably don't do version checks. But I guess the question there is still like, how do I just print the version number of my app, right? And I guess you could probably get away with
There, the way you do that is you stick it in a assembly attribute.
yeah.
Well, but
How do you get that? By the way, I guess assembly entry level assembly is probably my first attempt, and then maybe that works.
well,
in
you could,
ASP.NET
yeah. I
Core.
mean, you could read the file version attribute contents, but that's not necessarily the same as the Win32 file ver data.
Right, but like, I mean, I would generally say if you go to assembly.get entry assembly, and then websites are rarely single file, right? And then you just you have the path. You can throw this to file version info, and then you get the actual Win32 one as well if you wanted to.
Right. I'm that there's the difference between the single file and not single file. Of single file,
Right, that's right.
Sure, you can ask what your assembly file version attribute was, but the file version may not even make any sense depending on what the host is generating, or the way that the single file generates the executable host. But the for other things it does, but you don't want the file ver of .NET. Probably. I mean, maybe you do, but you probably don't.
Well, most
and
likely
then
not.
file ver and file ver can be different, because why have one thing when you can have two that have the same name and almost always the same meaning?
I mean, let me actually record this one because it seems getting the file version info off of the application is more complex, because depending on single file versus .NET exec versus custom host, different paths need to be used. Yeah, I mean, file version info is probably the only yeah, the only other scenario would be
LMT.
file version info. Yeah. Where's this guy here? Here we go. Yeah. Let's just approve this as is and then just see what Jan is saying when he's back. You might throw a fit, but
Yeah.
easiest way to get feedback at Microsoft is you propose the wrong thing, right?
Indeed, and it's not like this wouldn't meet the scenario for porting into 5 at this point, so it's not like it's going to go out the door before he gets a chance to respond.
Right.
For sure.
Is it already Max Future?
It's
I thought it was 6.
Oh, 6. That's also fine, yeah. So, yeah. All right. Then this took longer than expected, but that was a good chat.
Okay. Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Auf Wiedersehen.